Good afternoon and welcome to our CSPS Social Policy Seminar for today, which we are doing today, especially in commemoration and in celebration of the Day of Scientific Renaissance in Africa, the DSRA. Today, we are talking about a topic that we think is really important for the continent. We are talking about agriculture, which is the backbone of many of Africa's economies, and also about employment and bringing those two issues together. The speaker is a research fellow at the Center for Social Policy Studies. This is Dr. Adwoa Gyapong, and I'm just going to give you a brief bio of her and then invite her to give her presentation. Um, so Dr. Adwoa, Yeboah, it's, as I said, a research fellow at CSPS. She has a PhD in development studies from the International Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Her areas of research expertise are resource governance, food education, and health policy. She has considerable experience in international development consultancy and has worked in several African countries. Today, she's presenting from her research on plantations and the state of agricultural wage labor in Ghana, an analysis of the policy and legislative loopholes in land deal governance. Dr. Gyapong will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and that should leave us time for discussion. So, Dr. Gyapong, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanikia and for the... Hello? Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Presenter view. Because you are sharing your screen, we'll see everything that's on your screen.
Everything. Okay, that's fine. All right. Okay. So my name is Adwoa Gyapong again, and I'm a research fellow. And today my presentation is about land deals or land grabs as we know them, but even more about the mode of operation. And so I'll be looking at plantations, and particularly oil palm plantations in Ghana, and how they are regulated to ensure that agricultural wage workers, their rights and are also protected under these systems. So more broadly, I'll look at three objectives. So first of all, to look at the extent to which the rights of farm workers are protected in the existing institutions for the governance of large-scale land investments, that is plantation land deals in Ghana. And then secondly, to look at how and why plantation land deals have minimal employment benefits for communities that I work at, that is in Kwanta South District in the Oti region. And the third is to look at the social policy options for communities that are stuck in unfavorable but legitimate land deals, because most of them sign these leases and they don't seem to know what to do about them. So more broadly, since 2008, the report about large-scale land grabbing became very pronounced on TV, among NGOs, environmental activists. All these social movements started talking about the rate at which large-scale lands are being acquired in African countries, but also even other countries like those in the Latin American areas, where lands are being acquired for agriculture, for biofuels, for minerals and others. But even if you're looking at, like this map shows, the scale of acquisitions that have been concluded in the African continent. And as we see, more than 12 million hectares of land have been acquired for several purposes, for the growing of oil palm, jatropha, sugarcane, soybeans, among others. And these are land acquisitions that range from 100 hectares probably to more than 200,000 hectares in some of these countries and communities. this map is from the Land Matrix, which is like the biggest like land portal to report on large-scale land acquisitions in the world. If you're looking at Ghana, the top 5 projects, this map shows like, the top 5 projects in terms of land that have been acquired for agricultural farmworkers purposes. And these range from various food crops, like I've already mentioned, but even there are lands that have been acquired for biofuel, particularly for jatropha, where many of them are now abandoned because the hype about jatropha and what it was going to do in the country and even in the world seems to have died down, and many investors more or less lost their investment because the projects were not generating the expectations that they had. And in the end, there are many communities and people who have lost access to those lands that they previously, and then going back to those lands become even more challenging for those communities. If we are looking particularly at lands acquired in Ghana for oil palm plantation, there are quite a number in Ghana, and these are mainly like lands that have been acquired since 2000, because in Ghana we have the GOPDC and others that really started from state compulsory land acquisitions, and so the dynamics are even a lot more different as compared to these newer ones. But the largest one is by Norpalm, that is more than 4,000 hectares, and then we have also the Volta Red plantation, which is one that I'll be talking about today. But even data on these land acquisitions are still not very, very accurate, in the sense that the land portal is picking information from different places, and sometimes they are not even verified. So for example, on this matrix, I see that it says that the Volta Red Farms has 650 hectares of land that are under operation. But in fact, if you go to the field right now, that land is abandoned. So there are, differences when it comes to how these figures are actually playing out on the field. And probably we need to do a lot more research to see the actual scale of acquisitions and how they're actually operating. My presentation today, I'm looking at, I want to focus on the extent to which the institutions that govern land and labor, agriculture, wage labor in Ghana are really there to support, the implementation of the so-called responsible land investments that are being promoted in the country and also globally. So I'm not going to focus so much on the case study and the methods, and I did this ABCD, but more or less to do that in relation to the policies that are in place, and then link it back to some of the evidence. But as an overview, I went to the Nkwanta South district, and that one is the yellow, where the yellow or brown color is, and the pink one is the KJB. But the plantation work is, the main one is but they also have smaller one. They have company at the KJB. So it's more like the land that was acquired, about 3,700 hectares of land that were acquired. The study communities that I visited are from Brenia, say Adwoa, Dodo Tamale to Dodo Papasi, because I wanted to really understand the scope of operations over there. And I said now, the land was acquired from families. So in these places, land is owned by families, it is not by chiefs. So the company, through a broker who is a politician in that neighborhood or that district, the 2 districts, actually is the one who led the whole process in getting all these communities, all the extended families, about 15 extended families of the Nchobo clan in the Nkwanta South district. Many of them are based in Bereniase, to give up their lands for this project. Obviously, to get all these families to agree to such a large scale land will be difficult, but the process was really kind of, the way it was communicated, and the way the narrative around it, that it was going to be an NGO for the communities one day, and that they were going to get big sums of money as compensation, and all of that is what actually really led them to agree. But of course, as we all know, it was really by a few family heads who signed the agreement, even without reading the lease lease agreement that was prepared for by the company's lawyers. More broadly, I did a mixed methods research, and I collected, I did a survey of farm workers, almost all of them, because of the fluid nature of the workers. Most of them are casual workers, so there's not a particular number of people who work there, but on an average, every day about just 100 people going to work. But if you're looking at all the group, then maybe around 250. I conducted semi-structured interviews with the farm workers, the staff of the company, the dispossessed people, the chiefs, and also did some institutional assessments, and then conducted focus group discussions as well. And I visited most of them also in their homes, so I had the chance to observe their home environments. In this work, I did a review of, I went through the constitution to see some of the provisions for workers. The Labor Act, I looked at it quite critically, and then some of the land administration policies and evaluations, how registration is done, and also to look at the investment policy. So I went through the GIPC website to see the incentives they give to businesses and the extent to which they actually go to ensure that they actually acquire land for the work they do. And very importantly is also the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of land tenure. This has come to be, one of the key soft laws to govern land grabbing or land deals in Africa and even globally. So there's a big one that is done by a variety of stakeholders. And then in the country also, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture also had one put in place in 2015 that are supposed to help guide these acquisitions and the extent to which they also promote employment in the country. So when it comes to land deal governance, globally, there are differences in the way they are conceived, because on the one hand, we have mainstream approaches that really focus on local economic development and the fact that investments are desirable. So, and also because there's a narrative that in Africa, small scale holders are not really productive. And so when there's this investment drive, then with plantations, we can be more productive and have a better and effective use of land. And most of these strategies, for example, have come from the World Bank and other, the FDB and other mainstream international organizations that really focus on productivity, efficiency, and then markets as well. And then on the other extreme are the civil society, who actually continue to advocate and campaign to stop and roll back these investments. And the reason behind, so we have the food sovereignty movement, we have various agrarian movements, we have the environmental movement as well, who are all kind of have been putting their voices out against these investments, that they are not sustainable, they dispossess small scale farmers, and it's not the kind of agriculture that a lot of peasants want, or a lot of rural communities or in other places of the continent want. And I think the main ideology behind this is that we don't need to impose other ways of production into other contexts. And so they have been more radical and propose alternatives like agroecology, where you look at the environment, you look at the existing practices, and then build innovations and research around what already exists. And then in the middle, we have some of the other international NGOs like IFPRI, who kind of look at it more like, okay, let's try and mitigate the impact. Investments are desirable, but we need to really figure out a way to ensure that the poor people are protected and that it actually benefits them. So this is more like human rights and best practices approach. And I think as a country, this is really where our direction is, in looking more into the more of the mitigation of impact towards facilitations on that continuum from the middle to the left. So the question is, we are here, and the whole narrative has been that we want investment. And I think even going to the communities, that was the whole narrative. We need development, we want visibility, and this company came in to give us that development and that visibility that we were looking for. So the question is, to what extent are we able to provide these investments, but also ensure that it actually benefits the people that is meant to serve? So I try to look at some of the key regulations and policies that govern labor more generally, because honestly, going through the documents, I realized that you don't even find a lot of, there is not provisions for agricultural wage workers. It's really all factory centered. And so I try to just look at the extent to which they really focus on these. And the main findings that I would say is that a lot of these policies are quite uncoordinated in the way they actually are supposed to function and help protect workers. And there are some overlapping mandates. And like I've said already, many of them are factory centered. And so agricultural wage workers don't really even play a big role. And obviously, like probably we all know, is that there are enforcement constraints, even when the provisions are there. So this work presents a critique of these regulations and in relation to the evidence that I found. And I'm doing this in three main ways. The first one is to talk about the fact that land deals or plantation agriculture by foreigners is being promoted because it's always job creation. That is always a narrative around it. But then when you look at the laws, you realize that there's no hard law to enforce employment, like I've mentioned earlier. There isn't. And then also the regulations do not dictate the business models. Of course, it's not possible to do that. And even the Labor Act actually categorically says that an employer may hire worker on the terms that suits operations of the enterprise. And this, I think, is very problematic. If companies can actually, work, and this is really the kind of direction that is being given to them, because I think as social policy people who are interested in the people, this is something that we really need to question as a policy. Besides, the GIPC also has very generous incentives for businesses. During my field work, I went to their office, I spoke to them, and I think one of the things I realized was that they go to a very long extent to help investors to find land, to make it easy for them to get the land, and all the provisions or all the requirements around, getting land or opening up such plantations in the cities is really about their capital profile and all of that. There's really not much provision made to ensure that the companies are working by the laws of the state when it comes to, or trying to ensure that like even jobs are even created for these people. So that's one of the biggest issues. But then again, even when the soft guidelines that are supposed to be there to guide these investments, because they came up after the report on responsible investment by the World Bank and other international organizations and critique from various civil society organizations, the many stakeholders came up to discuss ways to ensure that businesses or companies or investors really operate in a very responsible way. But they came in late and they are really not binding and very technical oriented. And so you look at, if you go through it, first of all, it puts investors, the state, the community on the same level when they're talking about participation and free, prior, informed consent and the need to have stakeholder consultation. The power dynamics that play out in these places is never really spoken about. When I went to the field, one thing that I realized was that women were not involved, the youth were not involved, even the chief of Berenice was just a passive, participant in these negotiations. And you, no matter what you say, even when you're talking to the company and the directors, they'll tell you, you met them, you discussed, you told them what you wanted to do, and they agreed. So I think that it's very important that we highlight, they highlight the power dynamics that really are at play when it comes to these kind of agreements. But again, they become checklists and tick boxes to show participation. And because of that, it's not really creating that intended impact that communities need. And as I've written here, they have become more of, this is what we should do for the communities as goodwill, instead of it being an obligation or being seen as a right to these communities. And second is the issue of institutional bypassing of agricultural workers. As I've mentioned, the labor laws, and they are all factory centered. And so if one even comes to the health and welfare and safety of agricultural workers, if they have to refer to the Factories, Offices and Shops Act, which I think even by its name is a bit, it shows its narrow focus and the way it neglects workers in agriculture, who actually constitute the largest share of workers, especially in rural communities, in as much as we all know that they are petty traders, they are doing other things, but people working in agriculture form a very large share of workers in the country, but we still don't find them here. In the Labor Act, for example, the place where there's a special provision relating to temporary workers and casual workers, obviously the act, as I've shown here, excludes piece workers, part-time workers, sharecroppers, apprentices. And I think it also indicates the fact that even the most vulnerable people who are going to fall into these categories are the ones who are actually ignored. And the agricultural wage workers that I worked with, they are actually piece workers, and their wages are calculated in a very interesting way, in a sense that the company uses a minimum wage and then sets targets for them, which nobody really knows the basis on which they set those targets. And so if you work an hour, you are paid this amount of money. And then if you work the whole day, then you get that minimum wage. So they are piece workers as well, and the agricultural wage workers. And we see that there's no provisions made for them in this act. Again, when I went to the communities, I realized I went to the local government, went to the planning, the planning director's place and all of that. It was very obvious that they had not even stepped foot on the plantation before. And one of the comments that I got was like, well, they pay their taxes. That's all. That's really what they care about more broadly. And this is where the challenges are. But again, it also links to the fact that land in Ghana is customary. So the assumption is that if people gave up their lands for a plantation, we don't have any say in this. It's their families. So even if there's something going wrong, it's not really our priority. The other things to look out for as a local government than really these problems that exist. So like I'm saying, like if you go to the plantation, 70% of them are casual workers and doubling as piece workers, and they are exposed to chemicals. They have faulty machinery. All the tractor operators are not licensed to operate, and the company knows this. So if there should be an accident or a major issue, they are not even liable because the people are not even licensed, and they have been trying various ways for the company to help them to acquire these licenses, and it's really never gotten any far. I witnessed several incidences of accidents and injuries and people who complain about chronic pain from the work that they do. And the third issue I also want to do is, I would say, it appears as if as a country we are legitimating, the status quo. And there's, research on land grabs that starts from the fact that, people were not even having this before the company came. So then if they are getting this now, why should they complain? A lot of the research, that is always the starting point. And I think this is very problematic because we are dealing with people who obviously don't have good conditions of in terms of their state of being. They are poor, they are vulnerable, they have bad weather conditions sometimes. Sometimes they produce food and they don't even get markets for their food and all of that. And it's important that we look at the structural issues around these problems. And when I went to the field, one of the things that I realized was, well, there's minimum wage. As a country, the minimum wage has been in place, and around the structural adjustment time, there was talk about it. And actually there were debates that is not really the best way to look at employment, because it distorts, effective, efficient labor markets and all of that. In recent times, the minimum wage is also coming up quite well. And the debate about it is really that, okay, it helps guarantee poor people to at least have a decent wage at the end of the month or at the end of the week or the end of the day. But the question is, are these livable wages? At the time of my research, the company was paying almost 50% more than the minimum wage at the time, which was around 9 cedis. We were paying around 14 cedis or so. But then it was still on piece rate. So the dynamics are even different. And the fact that they even they even do this on based on that calculation is quite also questionable. So it's still big, it's piece rate, and the minimum wage is still high. But then at the end of the day, still, that means that people were earning around 350, 400 at the end of the day. Most of them have large households. So you know very well that this is really not a livable wage. But then again, even in spite of that, the work on the plantation is task-based. They are target-based. And so there's not really anything like minimum wage, in the sense that even though the Constitution also ensures equal pay and expects orders like companies to ensure that there's equal pay. Now we talk about gender pay gaps and all of that in discussions. There are different opportunities for different people. So for example, even in the peak seasons, when farmers are making the most of the money, it's always the men. The men can do more than 12 different tasks on the plantation. The women are just tied down to about 2, mainly 1, collecting of loose palm fruit. And the men, they can do harvesting, they can do pruning, they can do loading, they can do so many things. But the woman is just one woman who is actually a machine operator. The rest of the women are just collecting loose. Sometimes they are asked to apply fertilizers. So in the end, they're actually being less paid because they have very limited opportunity. In the off-peak season, they really can't do much. But a harvester in the off-peak season can be asked to go and do pruning. And they still earn a lot more than the women. And one of the interesting things to note is even that for the harvesters, during the peak season, they could earn about 1,500 to 2,000 cedis a month. But in the peak season, the same woman who is working equally hard was still going to earn just maximum 500 cedis a month. So this is how the dynamics play out. Again, the harvesters are able to hire their own people to help them in the harvesting. If you look at the picture above here, this is a harvester with his niece who is serving as a carrier. So they carry the palm branches to a particular location for the loading people to come and take them. At the end of the month, he decides how much he wants to pay them. And many of these are women, they are wives. This girl had just finished JSS. I don't even think she was even 18 years at the time. So this is the dynamics that play out there. And at the same time, you realize that even these women are so vulnerable, and they actually are hoping and praying that they get incorporated into the main job, even as casual workers, because 75% of the workers are casual workers. And so even though the foundation is there for equal pay and they have the same amount of money for a particular task and all of that, you realize that at the end of the day, the dynamics are there and the differences play out according to gender, according to task, and even sometimes how their relations with supervisors and others. And the third thing is the Constitution also upholds the right to unionize. And this is a very big problem on the plantation for several reasons. They know that they have the right to unionize, but how do they do it? 75% of them are casual workers. So obviously, they are not particularly even keen on organizing because of the nature of the work. Most people don't, the company is always looking for people to come and work. That is actually the truth of the matter, in a sense that they have regulations against, absenteeism, but people are always absent and they can't even fire them because they don't even get labor to work for certain tasks like slashing. So they don't work on a very regular basis. So they're not even particularly keen on unionizing. And when they have tried to do that, the company has used reasons of security threats to kind of try to stop them. And I witnessed a letter they had written to the labor organization to help them to get this stalled and all of that. And they still really didn't make any headway with that. And this is creating fear. There's a lot of miscommunication of what they are, and even threats and violence of how things might work out if they go and protest. So they can't even strike, they can't do anything, and they just have to come and work as and when they need some money to go. So the point is, most people know that if they need some cash for something, they can go and get a job to do on the plantation. But for most people, it's not really the kind of work that they want. And at the same time, even unionizing becomes a problem. For the permanent workers, who are just a few, about 50 of them or so, who want to unionize, it's also that if the masses are not with us, how do we even do it? Nobody's going to listen to our voice. Nobody's going to hear us. So all of these are in place. These institutions are in place, but you realize that if you go to the ground, how they are implemented, the enabling factors are really, really not there. And so it's important that instead of policymakers and researchers, there's a need to really go beyond the here and now narratives or well-being. They are getting money at the end of the month, to look more at the structural issues. How can we support people, farmers, farm workers? How can we support even communities to make effective use of their own lands in their own way? But we realize that the discourses is really always against the fact that smallholders are not productive and smallholders cannot transform the agricultural sector. But here again, we find ourselves in a context where Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire alone is producing like 20% of the world's cocoa. How do they do it? The smallholders. So I think that it's important to look at what is going on and in relation to how we envision agriculture, but even again to look at how labor policies and how we protect the rights of these people. Because I mean, this is my PhD work, and so there's a lot of details. I'm not sure I can't talk about it all here. Maybe in the questions and the answers, you get to know a lot more about this project. But the question is that there are a lot of issues that came up, a lot of land access problems and challenges. So it's not even just a matter of the labor, the women who have lost access to any form of entitlement. And even because of the land registration processes that they followed, there are a lot of women who are not benefiting from the rents that the company is paying them, which is actually also meager. The company pays the landowners $5 per hectare every year. And this is what they were made to believe to negotiate on. They didn't even negotiate it was just imposed on them. And this is all because the broker said to them, let the white man come and put his palm on the ground. The rest we can talk about it later. All because he's going to turn the whole business into an NGO for them and they'll benefit after some years. So yeah, the whole point I'm trying to make here is that there are a lot of issues. It's not even just a matter of labor, but for this particular presentation, I just wanted to highlight the fact that there are many issues when it comes to protecting the rights and the livelihoods of the people that such projects are intended to serve, and it's particularly farm workers. And it's important that as social policy people who are interested in vulnerable people, the marginalized, what do we do in such instances? And for me, this is really where I would want the discussion to go. This is what I'm very much interested in going forward in the discussion, because I think that the evidence is there. I can share a link of my paper and my thesis and everything, but the evidence is there. But the question is, how do we go forward? We go to the field, we collect data, they want us to come back and help them, but it's so difficult. But if we want to be engaged scholars, we want to support such communities, how do we go on with advocacy? How do we go on with social policy interventions? As somebody would say, they said they have signed their death warrants. That is what somebody said. And the youth are very much agitated about what's going on. But it's their fathers who went to sign the contract, and the rent is coming to their fathers. And they are not getting jobs on the plantation because it's not the kind of work that they want. I have so many quotations and statements that people made that shows the kind of contradiction that they find themselves. So I spoke to one of the family heads. There are 15 of those family heads, and this is an old woman who is bedridden. And I went to her daughter and I spoke to her, and she said, they have already signed it. The elders have not said it's bad. What can I say? People are poor, and food crop farming is not yielding anything. So they need jobs. Let's go and see what they have done to the land. It's nicely cleared and beautiful. And for me, this is one of the biggest contradictions in the statement. But it's true. It's cleared and it's beautiful. And it's beautiful because they were looking for good jobs, that people will come there, they will see a plantation, an oil palm plantation that is providing a lot of jobs for the communities. But that's not the case. As she said, you would not meet people in town if the company were doing well. And it is even just farming less than one third of the acquired lands, because they cannot even keep up. They're not able to be in operation, and for several reasons, they're not even getting workers to work on the plantation, and neither are they able to really mechanize the production as well. So there are a lot of challenges that are going there. And I spoke to some other former workers that I met, and they had the similar sentiments about the fact that in the beginning, they looked at the company as one that was really going to transform, bring visibility. But in the end, they realized that that is really not the kind of work that they envisioned. And so these are some of the major challenges. And I think it also goes back, it ties down to other vulnerable groups, like we saw in what is written in the labor law. I'm sure there are so many other people who are working on part-time, the KIAs and others whose livelihoods are always under threat. And nobody really knows how they are being regulated to ensure that they are protected from exploitative working conditions. So I think for me, to just conclude, I'm not sure how much time I've used, but I'll be very happy if we can have a discussion around the social policy options for communities that are stuck in such unfavorable but legitimate land deals. Legitimate because they are leases that they have signed and the land was registered. The land commissioner said, well, they are the commissioner general. As for them, they are not interested in whose land it is. So far as it's registered, it's registered. So what do we do for them? What are the options for legal aid? Because the sentiment in the community is like, there are people who want to stop everything that is going on, but they don't even know how to go about it because of what has already been done. And there are a lot of clauses in that lease agreement that are quite ridiculous. And all is because they never read it. It was written by them by the company's lawyers. And for example, even their corporate social responsibility is tied to the company's ability to acquire 10,000 hectares more of land and to produce at a certain capacity. But as I'm speaking now and doing my field work, they had just cultivated 1,000 out of the 3,007 that they have. So that means the people are never going to get anything out of it. And the most they've got is like 1 or 2 boreholes and some community library. And that's really all it is. So I'm happy to end here, and hopefully we can get to discuss and we can share our thoughts on moving this forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gyapong. That was very interesting. I know we've all heard about these land grab deals and have been, I guess, conditioned to think of them as not necessarily a good thing. After all, if you hear the word grab, it suggests something negative. But I think what's particularly interesting about your research is like you go to the granular level and show the specific ways that it might be harmful and also how it affects different subgroups of people differently. So you talked about women, you talked about young people, for instance. So I think that's really interesting in helping us to understand better the issue beyond this sort of broad strokes is problematic. What I found also interesting, and by the way, as I mentioned in the chat, I'm waiting for people to contribute their comments or questions either in the chat or you can raise your hand and then I'll call on you to speak out your question. And while I'm waiting to do that, I'm just reflecting on what I heard. What I found interesting also is how the narrative of development can be used to do a lot of different things, right? Once you talk about development and we all buy into it, we are all obsessed with development on the continent, then it seems to be used as a cover for to justify all kinds of things. And the question you're posing is it really development and for whom is it development? Those are essential questions. I see that Kwejo Poku has his hand up, so please unmute yourself and make your comment or ask your question.
Thank you very much, Adwoa, for this work. So I would like to know if the entity, whether they were NGOs or limited liability company, and whether especially with regards to the wages that they pay to these agricultural workers, whether you had access to their books to know their financial position, whether it is the case that the business is not getting enough or not making enough revenues, or just that they are cheating the poor agricultural workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should I continue? Should
Yes,
I respond?
please go ahead and respond to that.
Thank you very much, Koju, for your question. So this company, as I'm speaking now, I think nobody really knows what it is. Even the current directors don't even know what it is, because it started off as SG Sustainable's oil company. And this is a company that in their plan was to use this Ghana acquisition as a pilot for bigger projects on the continent. So actually, when they started operations, I think about 2 or 3 years on, they moved to Cameroon and acquired almost 80,000 hectares of land. So they more or less like abandoned this one. This was quite like, what is 3,000 when we've already got 70 something thousand in Cameroon. And this became the talk of NGOs, Oxfam, Green Earth, and they put a probation on the project in Cameroon for some time, because in Cameroon, the lands are in the custody of the state, unlike here. So that is how the narrative came about. And so they kind of abandoned this one. And then it became Heracle's farm. And for the Heracles, nobody knows if it was still SG Sustainable's company or whether they sold it off to another company. But then after Heracles, apparently the director, the owner of the Heracles committed suicide after all those bad publications in the US. So they opened up a bid for someone to come and take it over. And this is where Volta Red came in. Volta Red had already acquired 650 hectares nearby in the KJB area, and then another small one they had acquired at Papase. So they came in and took over that one. And these ones are British. It's a British company that has, I think it does an energy, has a big plant or a big company, and it's a wise corporation in the UK. So we don't know, but from my conversations with some key informants in the company, the director here is who is a British, is now the director in the Cameroon project. So it could be the same people that are just changing faces and changing hands. It could also be that it's a different face. I never got to the nitty-gritties of that. So yeah, I didn't get the chance to go through their books, but I had a chance to speak to their accountant a couple of times, and I never got there. I think that they were almost on the verge of collapsing because they were not making that amount of probably returns that they anticipated. So there were times when, wages were delayed for like 3-4 months, and people started protesting, and then after Christmas or so they went to pay them. So yes, I can't really say that it's because they are not in good business, or because that is really just how companies operate. It's very hard to tell, but it's obvious that they came in, and in my first conversation with the directors, who are actually absentee directors, they come in occasionally to just come and monitor things and go back. It's being run 100% by Ghanaian managers. Their concern were actually about the fact that if people get to know about certain things, about land grab, how they are going to react, and all of that. So I think that is really about being in a remote area and knowing that you have the leeway to do certain things, and that is how I'll put it. But I cannot vouch for them whether they are in good business or not.
All right. There was a comment and a question in the chat. You can also look at it, but it's from Seth AJ, who says he would really like some answers to the questions that you asked. How do we make these kinds of studies benefit the people in the field? So he's really concerned about how do we make the findings that you have matter for their real life prospects. He says they expect our interactions with them, that's we as researchers interacting with them, to yield some tangible positive results. So could we, in presenting findings of some of these studies, invite key stakeholders like policymakers to attend or have representatives present? That is a big question. Do you want to? Mm-hmm.
It is, and I'm hoping that I get answers also from the people here, because I think that has always been my worry. You go and stay in these rural areas for 3-4 months. They see you as part of them. Everybody knows you. If I go there right now, everybody knows me. They call you madam, and they even want to bring you food. But then you know that they are really struggling and they want some answers. People made comments that I should come and stand for an MP in the community because now everybody knows me. But I think that the main challenge is really being able to go beyond these studies to do something that is beneficial to them, because otherwise then they become like tools for us to get PhDs, more or less. Of course, fine, we publish and we disseminate some of this information, but I think for them what makes a lot more practical sense is that we are able to find some ways of engagement. And I've been particularly thinking about, is there even a way to get legal aid for people like this? Because their lease is for 50 years. I think it's now right into about 15 years or so now. What do they do? Should they wait until 50 years? And what even happens after that? Would they even know their boundaries? Are they going to give it out to another company? Who is going to benefit? They don't know. And for most of the youth, if they had their own way, if they could get support, they would want to kind of stop the whole operation so that they get back their lands. But nobody really knows how that works.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a big question. I mean, this is not just about your research, but about the what research does for policy making. I mean, ideally, policymakers don't come and do research, right? So the idea is that there is a division of labor. We do research, they take up the research, and then they make policies with it. And then they are practitioners or implementers of those policies. But clearly, there's some disconnect, right, between what we do and what we think matters, and getting those studies to them, and then having it communicate to them in a way that matters to them and will motivate them to act. Because we see the studies and we think that is valuable. It's true that policymakers count research findings as maybe one of a number of considerations that they look to when they are making policy. So this question of how we can actually have our research translate to influencing policy is very important, and especially for a center like CSPS, where we are supposed to do policy advocacy, we are supposed to try to make that research matter. So obviously not something that we can talk about entirely here. In fact, one of the workshop, we want to have a workshop where we can address this and bring in policymakers and media folks to come and, help us to figure this out a bit more. I'm going to invite Jifa then Delali to ask their questions. And then there are a couple of questions in the chat also that we hope to get through before we close in about 5 minutes. Jifa, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can
Yes.
now, yes.
Okay. So Adwoa, thank you for the presentation. I think your work highlights a very important aspect of the state, and I want us to reflect more on the nature of our state and the logic of the state. On one hand, the state is touting modernization of agriculture and job creation, and so your work is similar to things happening in Adan, Adina, the salt mining community, the mining communities, and it keeps replicating itself all over. So I'm wondering that, especially from the human rights and social justice perspective, how can we position ourselves in relation to the state, which seems to be, it's also a class alliance with capital. The state is in alliance with capital, and then so people in the right areas are now at the mercy of both the state and capital. How do we reconcile this?
Yes.
Thank you.
So this is a big question, Jifa, and I think that you see that we have a very cunning state. The whole narratives around modernization, and I think the question is not even really that anybody is against modernization, but I think it's the way it is presented in a very simplistic manner, and the way it is imposed, and the way it is being presented, because we are looking at the state. Now the state is no longer even that we no longer call the state a state and then capital. It's fused together in one way or the other, because we still have the GOPDC was acquired by the state under compulsory land acquisition. There are still people who are squattering on those lands. There are still people who are in court because of the lands that were acquired by the state. And now GOPDC, for example, is now being taken over by the private sector, but it's still called GOPDC. Do you get it? So it's in that continuum, and it's very difficult to actually pin it down. But I think one thing that communities need to know is that the state is not necessarily for them. And I think that is always a narrative that we find. People think that, they are going to help us. The state can only help if there are good policies in place to ensure that the right things are done. And unfortunately, a lot of these policies, even the good ones, are not being enforced. So I think that is really where the challenge is.
Delali.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation as well, Dr. Gyapong. I want to know, I have three questions. The farmers, after their lands were grabbed, is there any effect now on their food production? And then if there's effect, I want to also know, is there a linkage between what is happening? Maybe if your work has found out, is there any linkage between what has happened, especially with the land grabbing and then migration issues? Is there any out-migration because of the project's outcome? Then two, you were saying the factory could not get workers, and then the youth are also complaining about not getting employment. What's the linkage? Is it that because the pay is not good, the youth are not ready to work, or the company is not ready to engage the youth? Then looking at what you presented, I realized 70% are casual workers. Mm-hmm. So when they are not really engaged with the factory, do they have any other livelihood activities that they are engaged in to support their families? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Delali, for your questions. Maybe I'll start from the bottom. The casual workers. So first of all, I was actually focused on the plantation plantation, not the factory. The factory workers are there. I did a bit of interviews with them, but I didn't really focus on them. They are in the KJB district, so they are working on a different even entity. So the company has the plantation as one entity and has the factory as one entity, and they don't even come together even the workers don't share anything in common. But most of them are casual workers, and they are what we call probably semi-proletariats, in the sense that because of the casual nature of the work, they have to produce food. So most of them are just doing small-scale farming alongside, and then working on the plantation. Some of them are motor riders. Some of them are just, petty commodity traders and all of that. The reason the company is not getting workers, I think that from the perspective of the community and the people, when SG Sustainable came there at first, they'll tell you, if you go to the community, everybody is there. They were doing nursery, they were felling trees, they were planting. It was very engaged. Even the women had canteens, they were selling food, but none of that exists now. So the question is actually really because the issue is mainly because the conditions of work is bad, is really poor. They are working under very bad conditions. They are working alongside targets, and the work is hard. So for most people, they only go there if they are really cash-strapped and they need money to do something quickly or pay a debt or something. So that's one, it serves that purpose. But most people are not regular workers. Apart from the permanent workers that live on the plantation, they have housing for them, or for them, most of them. It's really about the conditions of work. And you see, I spoke to the Association of the Family Heads, and one day they told me, when we go for meetings, they are telling us to pray for workers. Why should we pray for workers? Because people just don't want to work on the farm. They only go there if they need money for something. And work like slashing, like those who weed, if you go to them, they are always short of slashes. And the people who are slashing are very poor old men and in very vulnerable states. The young men are doing pruning and harvesting, because that's where the money is, and maybe loading. That's where the money is. I tried to do a bit of investigation about the migration. But one thing I realized is that most of the people who lost their farms actually found smaller farms nearby. Maybe they moved to a different community, or maybe they got a smaller farm to work on, or some of them are also now working on the plantation as well. So I can't give a very definite data about migration. And the farmers, the effect on food production, I think there has been, I have a paper it's part of my chapters in my thesis. There's been an effect, but more in the sense of what they have to produce now, because for those who are working on the plantation, the time constraints means that you have to be very, very strategic. If you are planting certain things, there are some crops are very tedious to cultivate. They need a lot more time. So many people are planting, or they are cultivating crops that they can do alongside the plantation work. Others also just literally do what they want to do. When there's off-peak season and then they are laid off, then they go and focus on their plantation. But I think the effect is really more on women and the kind of crops that they are producing now. It's quite limited as of now.
Okay, I really do like to keep our seminars, starting on time and ending on time. But I think in this case, if you guys will permit us, I'm just going to ask you to respond quickly to a few questions. So these are all related. It's about legal remedies, legal recourse for a number of things. So one from John Gyapong is there legal remedy for warped agreements that are clearly disadvantageous to people? Once they realize it, is there any way they can do something about it? Is there a legal remedy within the labor laws to address the wage gaps that you mentioned? And then finally, again from Issa Musa, is there legal remedy to deal with, to enforce proper labor regulations, to make sure that people are not exploited? So these three questions of the wage gap, the bad contracts or deals, and then general employment conditions.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. For the legal remedies, I think for me, that is where the biggest challenge is. Particularly in the labor law, agricultural workers are not particularly, integrated. It's really more about their casual workers, their piece workers. How do you even go and bargain on anything? The labor law excludes them. So it's a problem in that sense. And I think there's really important that researchers and policymakers really have another look at the labor law, because there are several gaps in it. When women are pregnant on the plantation, they just have to stop work because there's no way they're going to. There's no way around it, and so that is really the problem. And for example, there was a time. So the farmers, the family heads at some time wanted to pursue, a legal path to put the company to account. But because of the lease agreement and the documents they've signed, it ended up becoming like, okay, let's talk about this within, let's talk about it at home. And they made a few changes to some of the clauses, some of the Paris agreements, that if there's any litigation, they have to go and do it in Paris and all sorts of things. There are lots of funny clauses and you just wonder, how does this really pass? But so they try to amend some of them in non-formally or informally, but we all know that it doesn't really go any far. So I think that is where the problem is. The problem is the fact that agricultural workers are fundamentally excluded when it comes to labor regulations. So if they're excluded, where do you even start from? And I think this is where probably our legal practitioners can help us, and maybe together with other stakeholders who are doing similar work can try. And I think it's not just the Nkwanta people. I'm sure there are several of these going on. And as Tifa mentioned, there are salt miners. There are so many of them that are having to really deal with such issues. And I think that this is where we have to locate the problem and start from.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gyapong, for this presentation. And I want to thank our audience for being present on a Thursday afternoon. I'd like to remind you again that this seminar, even though we do have Thursday seminars, we did this one especially to celebrate the Day of Scientific Renaissance of Africa. And just to let you know that the university has planned a university-wide event. It's a high-level panel discussion chaired by the Vice Chancellor, and it's dubbed Ghana Asked Legon Answers. So basically, we have some answers to give you based on our research. And the panelists include Professor Ivan Adai-Mensah, who is an emeritus professor of chemistry and former VC of this university, Professor Ajamambedu Akusa, who's a professor of pathology and former director general of the Ghana Health Service, Professor Kofi Sefadide, emeritus professor of food technology engineering and former dean of the School of Engineering Sciences. Okay, there's quite a lot of them, include Professor Kwabena Frimpong Boateng, professor of surgery and former minister of environment, science and technology. So I guess that's why they call it a high panel, a high level panel. But this is at 4 o'clock at the City Conference Center on campus. There is also a link to join online, I'm sure on the YouTube, the University of Ghana's YouTube channel. So please join in as we continue to celebrate research that hopefully will matter to how we move forward as a continent. Once again, thank you, Dr. Gyapong, and thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you all for joining.